I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to On the Edge. Time now to go down under and talk with Professor Steve Keen of debtdeflation.com. Professor Keen has a new website that has just launched this week, debunkingeconomics.com. Professor Keen, welcome back to On the Edge.
Lovely to be here, Max.
All right, Steve Keen, it's been just over 5 years since the crisis began. Take us back to what triggered it, what the response was, and where we stand today.
Okay, well, if you like, the trigger is, where you don't get shot by the trigger, you get shot by the bullet. The bullet was the level of debt, and that was always coming our way for the last 60 years. But the trigger was the decision by the Banque Nationale de Paris to shut down its redemptions for its funds, which were exposed to the subprime, because even though it was a French bank and sort of been miles away from the whole thing, it had bought some of these toxic assets from the banks that originated back in America, and it's found it could no longer value them. They couldn't get any handle on what these things were actually worth, so they simply shut down the three funds, and that was the trigger that fired the bullet that shot around the world, that meant that the repo market came to a grinding halt, and banks all over the world found they could no longer roll over their short-term debt, and bang, we had a credit crunch in the beginning of a, take it seriously, guys, this is more than your average crisis.
Right, so back in 2007, in August, I believe, BNP Paribas, they looked at their books and they said, you know what, this subprime stuff, we don't know how to value it. We think it has a value way less than what we're being told. And then this sent shock waves through the system. And since that time, the response has been to try and deleverage. However, that's not going so well, is it, Steve Keen?
Well, the deleveraging is happening by the private sector. In fact, what's they've been trying to do is to stop the deleveraging, because the people in control of the system don't believe the level of debt matters. They think if we can just get back to borrowing money like we were doing before the crisis, everything will be hunky-dory. And what they've actually done is discourage the private sector from deleveraging, so that there's a huge plunge in the level of debt in America. It went from, in 2008, the last year before the crisis really hit home in terms of the turnover of money rather than just the capacity of banks to roll over their repo agreements. The change in debt in America went from plus $4.5 trillion to minus $2.5 trillion 2 years later. So you had a $7 trillion turnaround in the size of the turnover on the American economy, for screwed financial markets everywhere. What they've done is you've got to get back to lending, guys. You've got to lend money. Banks lend money. That's what we need to have. And they've actually tried to restore the previous behavior, which had led us to the biggest debt bubble in human history. So in some ways, what they've done is, yes, it's made the downturn less painful because it's slowed down the rate of deleveraging. Yes, it's also put government money in there and balanced the fact that the private sector is deleveraging. But the overall effect has been to slow down the rate of deleveraging, which could mean we truly do turn Japanese, and we might face 2 decades of slowly grinding our way out of debt we should never have got into in the first place.
All right, so over the past couple of decades, the strategy of putting debts that can't be paid off the balance sheet somewhere, hiding them somewhere, is one that ultimately there's a backlash. The same way if you took garbage and you kept putting your garbage, in a room away from the living room in your home, eventually the stink and the smell of the garbage would destroy the entire home. So this debt, no matter how badly you try to hide it, no matter where you try to put it, now it's at a point where it's too stinky. You just can't hide it anymore. The smell of the corpse of the debt is too obvious. Now, you support a debt jubilee, but as there seems to be no political will or popular support for that, what do you do the next 5 years in terms of deleveraging? What's necessary? Where do we go from here? If the debt jubilee is not going to happen, then what's plan B?
Well, actually, funnily enough, just recent, Anatol Kolesky has come out supporting something similar to what I'm talking about. Because I've talked about it called quantitative easing for the public. And by that, what I meant is, rather than giving the money to the banks, which is totally useless, the analogy I draw there is that it's a bit like saying the car's run out of petrol, let's put oil in the engine. When you need petrol in the tank, not oil in the engine. That's what putting money into reserves has actually done. But what I wanted to say was give the money to the public instead, but require the public to pay the debt down. If the individuals had debt when they received this largesse from the central bank to the public rather than to the banks, they'd be required to pay their debt level down as the very first thing they did. Now, Anatol Kolesky's come out just in the Times in the last couple of weeks, and he's been saying what he calls quantitative easing for the people. And he's saying, give the public money. Let them do whatever they like with it. If he's able to say that, then they're listening. So the possibility is maybe that given the sheer failure of the strategies supposedly they're following in Europe right now to do anything but make things worse, maybe the fact that there's been such pain from the austerity program and there's such a fear about a backlash, we might not get what I want, which is paying the debt down, but we may get a sort of piddling version of that, which will still be more beneficial than what they're doing right now, of giving money directly to the people. So it could be a bit of an inflection point here. But you and I both know that there's a depression in Europe, and it is not something which we're sort of saying it's like the first Great Depression, only not quite as bad. It's like the Great Depression and just as bad for Europe.
The narrative of the Depression is now being referred to, that period of history, because the crisis is now bookending that crisis from the 20s and 30s. And the story that we hear is that the Depression, we got out of the Depression in the U.S. because of either A, the Keynesian stimulus programs of deficit spending, or B, the arrival of World War II. But we never hear the idea that the reason the U.S. got out of the Depression was because of the Pecora Commission, getting rid of the corrupt bankers, and then things like Glass-Steagall coming along and FDIC coming along, which set the stage for a recovery in the economy because you were bringing back regulation. And additionally, the reasons we got into the Depression in America, nobody mentions the fact that it was caused by bankers. It wasn't caused by anything else to the extent that it was caused by bankers. So how do we get the true story to the people so they make a better judgment in terms of how to address the problem today?
That's what you and I and people like Ms. Shedlock and lots of others around the world are trying to get that message through, and it's incredibly hard. It's amazing how the old cliche that the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history is being played all over again, because we get so used to having the bankers being the people of great status in society, but they only acquire the great status because they create great debt. With that debt comes power as well. And back in the Great Depression, they really only did that for about a 6 or 7 year period. If you go back to the beginning of the 1920s, there was a mini depression back then, which they got out of very quickly. And then the bubble began again with acceleration in debt and the downturn of the 1930s. And it only was by about 1932 or 33 that the banks started to smell like that room of garbage you were talking about a while ago. And then you started getting things like the Glass-Steagall Act, which again wouldn't have been possible before the Pecora Commission. So somebody had to go in and find that stinking pile of garbage and point out the bankers created it, and that it was their responsibility. With the Pecora at their times, if only Bill Black had been appointed to this thing rather than the savings and loans, maybe we might get somewhere. But we've got to break that narrative where we think the banks are actually generators of wealth. And this is the thing, they're not generators of wealth. They're a necessary part of a well-functioning capitalist system when they provide the debt that's necessary to fund investment in excess of retained earnings by firms that are actually investing and building new products. They become the parasites of the system when they create debt and actually create it to finance Ponzi schemes where people are gambling and rising asset prices, and the fact that they're lending the money is fundamentally the cause of those asset prices rising. So we simply have to break that mentality. But unlike the Great Depression, where they only had something like about 7 years of that mentality to build up, we can really date this thing back to 1985, 84, 83, when the post-80s recession boom began, and Greenspan's rescue in 87. So for people who were born in 1983, right through to now, 30 years later, all they've seen are the banks are the kingpins, the banks are the movers and shakers, and it really is a case they've almost got to go through a religious denial. That we've got to become banking atheists before we're going to see progress. And it may take 2 more years of putting in banking purgatory before they actually do that.
Right. Well, a true free market capitalist system would have penalties as well as rewards. In capitalism, you would need losers. You can't simply mollycoddle the losers, in this case banks like JP Morgan and others who are gaming the system. But I want to turn to Europe for a second. According to how you model the economy, it is private debt that is the bad debt. Yet continental Europeans have far less debt than Americans and Brits. So why, if you read the newspaper, is Europe the center of the debt crisis?
Well, Europe, you have to stop blaming just the bankers and start blaming the economists as well, because the bankers helped design the European central bank structure, but they were really following the myths of neoclassical economics. And Wynne Godley put it beautifully back in 1992 or 1993, that long ago. And he said that because the people who designed the Maastricht Treaty thought that all you needed was a central bank that didn't actually function as one, but was just a central monetary authority, not under the control of any of the nations of Europe and not required to fund their deficits if they went into deficit, they must believe that the economy necessarily reaches equilibrium on its own. And the best way to let it reach equilibrium is to get governments out of the way. So you had a strategy which said that you couldn't have monetary policy because there was a central monetary authority. You couldn't have fiscal policy because that monetary authority wouldn't fund deficits larger than 3% of GDP for any of the nations of Europe. And you couldn't have exchange rate policy because you had one currency. There was no possibility to devalue the Greek euro against the German euro. So they were trapped in the belief that a market economy necessarily reaches equilibrium. Now, even Milton Friedman, writing in 97, said, hey, this is crazy for Europe because only if you didn't need exchange rate variations could you get away with that. And if you had fiscal policy as well to make up for the fact that some states of Europe, like Greece, didn't do as well as other states of Europe, like Germany, which would be a bit like Alabama versus California in America. So even Milton Friedman can say this thing wasn't going to work. And therefore, when it collapsed, it was a man-made collapse. Capitalism alone ain't to blame for this. It's our beliefs about how capitalism functions that helped make this such a disaster in Europe. And then those beliefs were combined with the attitude that the way to stimulate an economy is to have the government pull out of the way, fiscal austerity. Now, the reality is that money in the economy, you need money to make the economy turn over. If the private sector starts deleveraging, and Europe has been doing that during this crisis, the private sector, then if the government does the same thing, you've got two sources dragging demand out of the economy at one time, which means it goes down even faster than it would if just one was. So you've got a classic experiment going on here, and this is the sort of thing that Paul Krugman and I can agree upon, that the American approach, where they've gone for deficits, has meant that the American downturn has been fairly mild, whereas the European approach, where they've had deleveraging and austerity, has been extremely severe. So it's a very strong argument. In a downturn like this, you must have fiscal stimuli, but that's not enough, of course, from my point of view. You've got to have debt abolition as well. Now, of course, in the European case, those debts also involve lending by German banks to Greek enterprises to let them buy German goods. So ultimately, the Germans and the French have to wear some of the cost with their banking sector collapsing and having to be rescued, hopefully more sensibly than the Americans have done, and they're still holding off on that point.
Right. Well, to have this kind of give and take between the public and private sector, you need a very clear distinction between what is the public sector and what is the private sector. And in economies like the U.S., there is no distinction. You have the private sector, and then you have the quasi-private sector called the government. And they both serve the banking interests. So there is no public sector or public interest anymore. That's long been gone. But let me talk about the Herald Tribune has a front page story today about the German economy. They credit the Mittelstand for taking on no debt, saving for a rainy day, and refusing to expand rapidly. Now, using that model that serves Germany so well, could all economies do this, or does that German model still rely on the overspending Brits and Americans to keep it going?
It does rely upon the overspending because, again, one point I can agree with Paul Krugman on is that if you actually try to save more as an individual, what that means you're going to spend less, which means what you're going to generate as incomes for other people actually falls. So that's the old paradox of thrift. It's one of the deepest pieces of wisdom in Keynes's writings, that if we individually try to save, we may well increase our own bank balances, but by increasing our bank balances, we're slowing down the turnover of money that enables the entire economy to function. So you can get an increase in the bank balances and a decrease in output. And I've actually done, using my Minsky program, which I'm developing now, I've modeled that phenomenon. It's quite straightforward. So an attempt to increase the amount of money you store in your bank, or increase the money you keep under your blanket if you don't trust the bank, actually will reduce economic activity and cause a spiral down the depression. So it's the wrong, it works as long as somebody else is spending big and you're getting an export surplus out of it. Because of now the German economy is starting to tank because those export surpluses require other people to be importing and they're no longer doing it.
Now, of course, on the topic of savings in the U.S., they're talking about getting rid of some of the social welfare programs. This is being talked about in the Republican camp. But if such things as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security were downsized or eliminated, then you'd have a savings rate like you have in China. The savings rate in China is extraordinary because there is no savings net for Chinese people. So isn't this a kind of a poison chalice? If they get rid of these programs in America, that means the savings rate is going to triple or quadruple, which means that the economy is going to crash anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a classic way of accelerating the downturn. So if the Republicans win and cliff routine and cut back on their fiscal spending, then you'll have America going into an accelerated downturn. And in many ways, it's tragic that we can't actually run controlled experiments on somebody else's planet to work out whether this stuff works or not. We've got to impose it on our own planet, and people suffer through the whole process. It's a great tragedy to watch this happening again because we didn't have to make these mistakes. We didn't have to let debt get out of control. We didn't have to have insane policies run by people in charge of fiscal policy. We're doing both again, and you watch it and you think, you know, didn't you guys watch any movies about the 1930s and the little bloke with the mustache and where he came from?
Right. Well, to get to your bigger point, the one that informs your book, Debunking Economics, is that the reason we get into these messes is because we tend to believe that we can ascribe empirical scientific certainty to economics, and that's a fallacy. Because for one thing, as you point out, in the hard sciences, let's say physics or chemistry, you have predictable outcomes, and that is the proof of your theory. In economics, there are no predictable outcomes. Therefore, the inputs going into your solutions and your equations are specious at best. And until we understand this, we're going to keep making the same mistake. That is to say, trying to come up with theories that are going to predict economic outcomes that always result in tragedy, correct?
Yeah, well, we can certainly do better than we've done in economics. So I'm not going to try to predict, but I would like to qualitatively describe the system we're in. And this is why my approach is so different to the neoclassicals. I'm building on the shoulders of a true giant, Hyman Minsky. And Minsky's position was that if you're going to have a model of capitalism, it must be a model that can have a depression as one of its possible states. He fundamentally said because the Great Depression had occurred, if you did a mathematical model of the economy that couldn't end up in a depressed state, you didn't have a model of capitalism. Whereas the neoclassicals, and my favorite there would be Edward Prescott, who got the Nobel Prize for building real business cycle theory with Kittleman back in the 1990s. Prescott has a paper called Some Observations on the Great Depression. Now, I really recommend people, you want to see the lunatics that took over the economic profession and awarded themselves Nobel Prizes, find that paper and read it. Because in that paper, Prescott fundamentally says the Great Depression was an extended holiday. His explanation of the Great Depression is that workers decided to work less hours, and that caused the Great Depression. That's lunacy. He actually says capitalism is fundamentally stable. That's now proven to be lunacy. So once you say, we get a model that qualitatively behaves the same way capitalism does, which Minsky's model did, and my mathematical model of Minsky also does, then you can actually say you're describing capitalism. So in that sense, I saw this crisis coming because standing on Minsky's shoulders and having a model where an explosion of the level of debt to income could cause a total black hole that the economy got sucked into, I saw this thing coming. The neoclassicals were blindsided by it. So we've got to get models which, even though they can't be experimental and predictable in the way the ones in science can, they've got to match the qualitative behavior of the economy, and that includes the capacity to have depressions.
All right, finally, let's go back to Europe for a second. In Greece, it's just been reported that 20% of all loans are non-performing. It's also been reported that their economic activity has contracted by a greater amount than had been previously forecasted. Now, here's an idea that you've mentioned, and I wanted to have you speak on it briefly. Should Greece introduce a parallel currency?
Yeah, I had to think for how you can get out of this problem. And when I looked at it, the obvious point was that the euro is a currency, a national currency of a country that doesn't exist. It is more like special drawing rights, because it's the way the special drawing rights work, which was Keynes's idea about how to manage the post-war economy. Rather than having a national currency as your reserve currency, invent something produced by an independent central authority, produced in proportion to the size of economies. It's called special drawing rights, and people have to trade inside that. That really is what the euro 99% is like. The trouble is they made it 1% more, and they said use that external currency for internal trade as well. That's led to this catastrophe. So what I've proposed instead is one potential way out of the crisis, that we institute on some given day, as well as having the euro, we have the euro drachma, the euro peseta, the euro mark, all starting at a one-to-one parity with the euro, and all debts are instantly converted into euro drachma, euro lira, euro peseta debt, depending on the country they're in. And then we let those currencies float. Of course, what would happen is the euro drachma would drop drastically against the euro, while the euro mark would rise against the euro. And then after a period of time, say a year, you then freeze the ratio between those currencies once the market's worked out what they should be, and the euro becomes the currency used for international trade and trade between European states, while each of those states themselves use their own euro drachma, euro peseta, and so on, with fixed exchange rates at that time to the euro. And then you've got the mechanism Keynes wanted to have, where if you start running a trade deficit, then you're forced to devalue. If you're running a trade surplus like Germany was, you're forced to spend and stimulate the other economies. Now that's a structured way of bringing in a parallel currency for all these nations, and it could also handle the debt straight away. And I think that might work as a way out, far less drastic than what we're seeing, because the way we're going, we face the possibility, I think almost the probability, of a military coup in one of those countries, when the military said, we've had enough of you politicians, we're kicking you out, and if you want to come and get our debt, all you've got to do is climb over this tank and this row of landmines, or a just disorderly collapse of the euro and incessant poverty for the countries that stay in it.
All right, Steve Keen, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on The Edge.
You're welcome. Good to be here again.
And that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Professor Steve Keen. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.